Hello, welcome to A Simple World. This is our first video, and if you enjoy it, you can support us by subscribing to this channel and our Patreon if you can afford it. Before I get into the video, let me just say I am not advocating for or against anything. If you feel like I've made a much stronger argument in favor of one opinion over the other, please be aware that that is my intention. I also feel that I should mention that I am black and certainly not American. So in this essay, I'm both an insider and an outsider on this topic. What are black nationalists and what do they believe? Defining black nationalism is tricky since a definition is mostly constrained to time and space. While the reactionary white nationalists today and 100 years ago may not be indistinguishable, black nationalism is more complicated. Different organizations are present across the political spectrum, but there is a common resemblance among nationalists. Nationalists believe that race is or should be synonymous with a nation, and that nations possess special traits and talents unique to them, which manifest in traditions, art, literature, music, architecture, etc. Black nationalism has not been an active force in American society, mainly because they have never had tangible political and economic power, so their influence is mostly confined to cultural conversations. There have been 3 periods in American history when black nationalism was able to take root for a while, and all these periods seem to have been a reaction to some American crises which affected black people. During Reconstruction, after the re-emergence of the KKK and the labor movements, and the Civil Rights era or the emergence of black power. Black nationalists around the Civil War wanted to emigrate to countries in the Caribbean. Some white and black leaders who were anti-slavery did believe that black and white people could not coexist. Thomas Jefferson. Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end but in the extermination of one or the other race. Abraham Lincoln's address on colonization to a committee of colored men in 1862. Even when you cease to be slaves, you are yet far removed from being placed on equality with the white race. It is better for us both, therefore, to be separated. Black nationalists often agree that blacks and whites cannot coexist. This is white man's country. He found it. He conquered it. And we can't blame him because he wants to keep it. I'm not vexed with the white man of the South for Jim Crowing me because I'm black. I never built any streetcars or railroads. The white man built them for your own convenience, and if I don't want to ride where he's willing to let me, then I'd better walk. Marcus Garvey. The most known and certainly long-lasting is Conservative Nation of Islam. This is probably the flavor of black nationalism people associate with when they criticize the movement. The organization is about building an African mythology, often false, which attempts to build a new culture from mainstream black history. It mostly uses religion as its crutch. The nation rejects the perceived slave master's religion, Christianity, for a better religion they consider the true black religion, being Islam, arguing that at best Christianity was an opiate, promising black people redemption in heaven at worst. It reinforced white supremacy by worshipping a blue-eyed blonde man or God. Despite its ardent enthusiasm, they did not believe that racism could be solved without divine intervention, their hope being that God would selectively rain fire and brimstone on white people or something like that. So, yeah. During the period around the 60s, the Nation of Islam defined black nationalism as opposition to integration, believing that assimilation into white society means losing one's cultural and racial identity. They embraced black capitalism and racial pride. They were mostly passive in politics. As I mentioned, they believed in divine intervention more than anything. The Nation of Islam appealed to the lived experiences of working-class black males by offering solutions to racial oppressions, poverty, unequal education, drug and alcohol abuse. In 1959, 50% of black families were classified as poor. The median family income for black families was roughly 54% that of whites. Statistics such as this made the appeals of the nation reasonable at the time. The rate of their growth in the late 50s and early 60s was catalyzed by Malcolm X, formerly known as Malcolm Little. Malcolm X is a strange figure who seems to fit into most pegs of the black nationalist canon, since the reactionary crowd can use his fiery, uncompromising rhetoric before his pilgrimage to justify their existence through them, and the black revolutionaries could justify themselves by his by-any-means pragmatic period after his pilgrimage, and a particular connection he made between capitalism and racism in Africa. Malcolm Little was a hustler, a pimp, involved in drugs and crime. During his 7-year stint in prison, he was introduced to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. Blacks should live a disciplined and moral life, eschew drugs and alcohol, and establish a separate nation. He was susceptible to the teachings of the Nation of Islam. He felt his sentence was unfair since it felt like he was mostly punished for being with a white girl. The Nation was against civil rights leaders like MLK Jr. and other organizations like the NAACP, since they viewed them as representing the interest of the middle class rather than the immediate problems of ghettos and inner cities. Malcolm X summarized in his Message to the Grassroots House in 1964, House Negro and the Field Negro, to emphasize these apparent class cleavages. Malcolm X explained in a speech in 1964 that during slavery, there were two types of Negroes, the House Negro and the Field Negro.
The history of slavery, to understand this, there were two kinds of Negroes. There was that old House Negro and the Field Negro. And the House Negro always looked out for his master. When the Field Negroes got too much out of line, he held them back in check. He put them back on the plantation. The House Negro could afford to do that because he lived better than the Field Negro. He ate better, he dressed better, and he lived in a better house. He lived right up next to his master in the attic or the basement. He ate the same food his master ate and wore his same clothes. And he could talk just like his master. Good diction. And he loved his master more than his master loved himself. That's why he didn't want his master hurt. If the master got sick, he'd say, "What's the matter, boss? We sick?" He was as sick as the master. When the master's house caught a fire, he'd try and put the fire out. He didn't want his master's house burned. He never wanted his master's property threatened. And he was more defensive of it than the master was. That was the House Negro. But then you had some Field Negroes who lived in huts, had nothing to lose. They wore the worst kind of clothes. They ate the worst food. And they caught hell. They felt the sting of the lash. They hated their master. Oh, yes, they did. If the master got sick, they prayed that the master died.
They tried to subvert it. Bringing his metaphor to the present, Malcolm X concluded that the black population still consisted of house and field Negroes. Malcolm identified himself as a field Negro. As powerful as a metaphor it was, it did ignore the historical precedents. Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and Gabriel Prosser were house slaves. After his pilgrimage, he embraced his more by any means necessary approach to activism, meaning that he would pragmatically work with anyone who shared his political agenda. By any means necessary wasn't a call to arms or advocate violence. It was more like anyone, mind you, I am saying anyone, who overtly, intentionally, and knowingly deprives another of his human right is a devil. I said anyone who does this is a devil, and if he consciously, knowingly, and intentionally deprives the man of knowledge that will enable him to correct his condition, he is a double devil. Thus did Malcolm X survey the alleged relationship between race and Islam. As he explained, Islam as a religion has nothing to do with color. On the leftist side, as compared to the reactionary Nation of Islam, you have the Black Panthers Party, being the most known socialist flavor of black nationalism. It wasn't a strictly black nationalist organization since its analysis didn't center much around race. It was more revolutionary. The ultimate goal was to topple capitalism as they embraced more Marxist-Leninism. With this belief, their platform included items like full employment, decent housing, education that taught true history, exemption from military service for black men, and an end to police brutality. They engaged in a number of black consciousness raising through education programs and other community programs like country-spanning breakfast for children. Their activities were subverted by the state through targeted harassment of members. Many of the Panthers were killed, including the charismatic Chicagoan Fred Hampton. The disillusionment with the promise of equality of white capitalism may be justified. The only attempt at true black capitalism was a failure. Black capitalism is black power in the best sense of the word. Richard Nixon. Black capitalism was an idea that was present in all black nationalist groups except some elements of the Black Panther Party. We do not fight exploitative capitalism with black capitalism. We fight capitalism with basic socialism. Bobby Seale. The place where black capitalism would be realized was a rural settlement in South Carolina. It would be known as Soul City, a name which had negative connotations for white people. It was to be a mini metropolis of around 50,000 people. Its founder was Floyd McKissick. Soul City appealed to the disenfranchisement of black people. Soul City was a place where black people can come and know they're wanted. Black capitalism depended on the benefaction of white capitalism. It was financed by a loan by Chase Bank. Trying to achieve independence from white power made McKissick more dependent on whites to establish his utopia. Its establishment faced political and media criticisms. I do not favor the expenditure of taxpayers' funds for the project known as Soul City. Jesse Helms, North Carolina Republican Senator, 1972. The chasm dividing the present dream from the future reality could hardly be greater if Mr. McKissick intended to build the city on the moon, the Baltimore Sun. The enterprise did receive grants and millions from the Nixon administration. The dream of a planned utopia was riddled with incompetence and never really came to fruition as imagined. By the time of the Carter administration, it was a foregone dream. Of course, there were some unsavory elements of black nationalism, especially in the Nation of Islam. I mean, can you consider yourself a true hate group if you don't hold the Jewish population in some contempt? But some black nationalists were sympathetic to Jews. Du Bois told the Second Pan-African Congress in 1919 that the African movement means to us what the Zionist movement must mean to the Jews. Black nationalism is probably an interesting study in racism, or more specifically, that one cannot be racist if they do not have power. It is difficult to say what black nationalism would have grown into had it not faced institutional, state, and federal pressures like the FBI's COINTELPRO operation. The worst of the black nationalist groups was not actively politically involved or actively militant against white institutions. The image of a racist American is probably one of a lower-class, working-class white Southerner. This becomes interesting because they are often as powerless and unfortunate as the black lower class, and in their case, could it be said that they're not racist as they spill racist slurs? I don't think any progressive can argue for them. Or maybe it could be said that even if they're poor, the institutions of the country still favors them. The FBI never actively targeted the KKK after all. Can blacks be racist? To this question, I give you David Pilgrim's answer. The answer, of course, will depend on how you define racism. If you define it as prejudice against or hatred toward another race, then the answer is yes. If you define racism as the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race, the answer is yes. And if you define racism as prejudice and discrimination rooted in race-based loathing, then the answer is, again, yes. However, if you define racism as a system of group privilege by those who have a disproportionate share of society's power, prestige, property, and privilege, Then the answer is no. In the end, it is my opinion that individual blacks can be and sometimes are racist. However, collectively, blacks are neither the primary creators nor beneficiaries of the racism that permeates society today.